Hi, everybody. I am Robin Davis from Greensboro. I'm the inaugural president of Triad Wild, our Greensboro Triad area new chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. We are really excited to have this this evening together. Super excited for all of you to be here. And tonight we are also co-hosting the evening with Concord Wildlife Alliance, which worked out really well. So Serena Dellinger, you'll see in your screen, she is president of Concord Wildlife Alliance. Hi, Serena. So she's going to have a few announcements in a minute. I just wanted to take a minute. We certainly had hoped to have our first meeting in person. So it's a little interesting starting a new chapter and having it be a virtual meeting to start off with. But I also say I'm really grateful that we have this technology in our life right now and that we can all meet safely together like this. So I think it was a great call for tonight. So we're glad to have you here. Super excited to have Katarina here to talk to us tonight about the red wolves. And also want to just introduce Tara Moore in case anyone is new to this group. Tara works for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation out of Charlotte, and she is immensely helpful to all of us in coordinating all of these events and all the questions that we have. And she is just a real resource and a lovely person on top of that. So
thank you, Robin. Good to see you all.
For being here. So I'd like to introduce the Triad Wild Board, if I could tonight. Peter, would you like to say hello to everyone? Introduce yourself. Unmute.
Hey, you can tell I'm not, real good with the technology stuff. Sorry about that. So I'm Peter Zaynard. I'm like Robin and Joni and Heather, and I guess Ann may be here and all that, one of the founding board members, and very excited about Triad Wild and moving forward. And I don't want to waste a lot of time, so that's all I'm going to say right now.
Okay. Heather Russell. Heather is our secretary and photographer.
Well, you just said it. Hi, I'm Heather. I'm one of the founding members. I guess we all are. As Robin said, I'm the secretary, part of the social media group, and photographer.
Glad to have you here tonight, Heather. Joni Lambert is our treasurer. I'd like for Joni to say hi.
Hey everyone, it's really nice to see you all here. It's super exciting. We appreciate your participation at our inaugural event. I am excited to have worked with these fine people to get this chapter going, and we look forward to providing a lot of great and interesting content and programs. So thank you all, and it's really nice to see you.
And last but not least, what a pleasure it has been to have the opportunity to work with Ann Berry Summers as advisor to the board. And it's great to see your smiling face here tonight. Would you like to say hello?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm glad to be here. I have loved working with Triad Wild and these board members. I am a board member of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and recently retired from UNCG, even though I am teaching this spring. But look forward to seeing you in person at some point, and until then, on Zoom. Thanks for coming.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Serena. I know she would like to make an announcement about Concord Wildlife Alliance and what they have coming up. So Serena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you guys for letting us tack on to your first official meeting. We had planned to do an in-person movie night, but with the rise of COVID again, we decided to go virtual, and we wanted to do a Red Wolf program. So we were really excited you guys were offering that. So thank you for letting us join in. The only announcement I really have is that we are currently planning to have a February meeting. So it'll be February 8th at 6:30, hopefully in person. And it'll be with a company out of Charlotte called Issa Vibe. And their whole focus is reconnecting people, and specifically people of nature with people of color with nature. So we're excited to hear from them and hear about ways that we can connect with people in our community and in the larger Charlotte community. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you guys again.
Great, thank you. Maybe Serena, you could put that company's name in the chat so everybody could see that.
Yep, I will. Thank you.
Good. Okay, without further ado, it's time to introduce Katarina Ramos tonight. Katarina is, I've heard her speak once before, and I just loved everything that she had to say about the Red Wolf Project. So exciting to have her here tonight. Katarina is currently the North Carolina Wildlife Refuge volunteer and program coordinator at the Red Wolf Center, which is in the Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. That is a mouthful. But she works in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to spearhead this conservation project. And tonight, I think she's going to be bringing us up to date with the most recent happenings with the Red Wolves in North Carolina. So Katarina, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to y'all today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So as Robin said, my name is Katarina Ramos. You could absolutely call me Kat. My full name is a mouthful, and I think it gets some people nervous about pronouncing it. I am the Refuge Volunteer and Programs Coordinator for Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. I work for North Carolina Wildlife Federation, but I have a memorandum of understanding with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do what I do here, which is talk about red wolves and help bring public awareness to red wolves. So today I'll be talking about the endangered American red wolf. I really love saying American red wolf because they really are an American species. It's really awesome. So let's hope that my PowerPoint works, and apparently I have to do it this way. Okay. So the first thing I want to start off with is what a red wolf is. And I know this sounds really funny because it's a red wolf program. But there's a large part of the world that has never even heard of a red wolf before, and they are such a gorgeous species of wolf. The first thing I want to say, there's only two species of wolf that actually exist, and that is gray wolf and red wolf. Every other wolf you hear of, the Mexican gray wolf, the tundra wolf, any of them are actually considered subspecies of the gray wolf. However, there's only two distinct species, and the red wolf is the other one. So these guys are pretty small. They're about 42-ish pounds to around 80-ish pounds. They are relatively small in size compared to its counterpart, the gray wolf. They're mostly known for that reddish color on them, which of course gives them their name. And they have a little bit of brown mixed in with some tan and black, with some really striking white on their muzzle, and red on their ears and legs. So you'll see different variations of wolves. You may go to one of our locations across the states that houses red wolves, and you may see wolves that are a bit more grayish or a bit more reddish than others, and it's just all part of their genetics, but they all have that same distinct kind of coloration to them. Their eye color can be anywhere between like yellow, orangey, brown. My pets have decided to go running. Okay, I'm so sorry. So they can have that typical wolf amber gaze that we all know and love. And some of the distinguishing traits about these guys that is really important in the field is their leg length. I've always heard our field team say how they're walking around on stilts compared to what other animals in the area look like. They just have these really beautiful long legs. They also are known for their large feet and their rounded ear tips. Very adorable. I may say so myself. So now that I told you what a red wolf is, and we saw a nice picture of it, how did they become endangered? And so one thing I want to point out is that the red wolf used to be pretty wildly seen across southeast region of the United States. And it was only found in the United States. So that's why I consider it the American red wolf, and why I love saying the American red wolf, because it truly is an American species. So they used to be found anywhere between Pennsylvania all the way down to Texas. And over time, they slowly started losing their habitat, and their population started dwindling and getting more reduced until they were only found in, apparently, I don't know how to use my own thing, in this part of Texas and Louisiana, this very, very small area in Texas and Louisiana. And there's a really big reason as to why that happened. It was really because of human growth. So as we have all learned in history class that there was a huge population growth for the United States citizens in the early 1900s. So we started getting more people growing and the population started becoming more complex. We started taking in more land. And with that came a whole bunch of other problems within our environment. So we started seeing that the wolf habitat started getting broken up, which is what we call habitat fragmentation, where you have patches of land instead of continuous land across a landscape. And for wolves to survive on the landscape, they need larger pieces of land in order to gain resources and survive. In addition, with the amount of people coming in and the population growth, we found that there was a really negative public perception of the wolf. And that was mostly because it's written into our folklore. So if we remember Little Red Riding Hood, even watching Beauty and the Beast, Frozen, one of the more iconic Disney movies now, I guess. There's always this negative perception of wolf that it's inherently dangerous or inherently aggressive, which led to predator hunts. So, you know, it's going to hurt us, so we need to make sure that we get rid of it from our area. We don't need that. So this caused the wolf population to truncate so much in its range that the red wolf was actually put on the endangered species list in 1967, and it has stayed there this entire time. So we finally reduced them to, or put them onto the endangered species list. They were just reduced to the small area, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to figure out what they were going to do to preserve the species, especially since they put it on the endangered species list. So from this tiny population in the early 1970s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided that they needed to trap as many individuals as possible in order to preserve the species. So in this small section of Texas and Louisiana, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service trapped all throughout the 70s to catch as many wolves as possible, and they ended up catching 17 wolves. In that area, they managed to catch 17 wolves. And from those 17, they tested those wolves to see what their genetics were like and figured out that 14 of them were distinct enough from one another that they are now the basis of all red wolves that we see today. So if you were to go to a zoo or come to the Red Wolf Center or even have the wonderful opportunity to see one of these guys in the wild, they are a direct descendant of these 14 individuals, which I think is really cool, but I could geek out about that all day. So from those 14 individuals, there's a lot of concern to be brought about bringing a population of wolves back from the brink of an extinction from 14 individuals. So that's where captive breeding comes in to help. So in the early 1970s, when we started catching all of these wolves, Point Defiance Zoo actually helped establish a captive breeding program with Fish and Wildlife Service to help preserve the species. And by the time that the red wolves were declared extinct in the wild in 1980, they had over 60 individuals in captivity, which is phenomenal and so impressive. And there's a lot of difficulties that come with captive breeding, and I just think it's so impressive at how they manage the species and continue to grow the species. So with the growth of the species and it getting declared extinct in the wild, the Fish and Wildlife Service had to determine what they were going to do to continue moving forward with the species recovery. And that led to where we currently have our red wolf non-essential population. So the species was declared extinct in 1980, and by 1987, the Fish and Wildlife Service deemed that we had enough individuals in captivity to be able to introduce wild captive individuals into the wild in Northeast North Carolina. So as you can see, I have it circled over there, and there's that little blue dot on North Carolina. So the first individuals that were introduced into the wild in 1987 were actually introduced on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. There were 7 pairs of wolves that they introduced on the refuge, and they continue to grow the individuals throughout the 80s and the 90s, creating the recovery program's 10J rule in 1995, which allowed them to do introductions, monitoring of the species, brought the recovery area from just Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge all the way to the 5-county area, which is Dare County, Terrell County, Beaufort County, Hyde County, and Washington County. So a really large recovery area. And before we knew it, in the early 2010s, we had a population of around 120 wolves that we could monitor, which is fantastic. However, current day, we have 8 wolves. And I know you're probably thinking, how does that happen? Because that's a pretty big drop. I mean, 2010s was, I guess, a decade ago, but it wasn't that far ago that we had it, and technically the species is still here. So how did this happen that we saw such a large drop that we only have 8 known individuals in the wild? And that's because of a couple of things. So when the population started decreasing, there were a couple of factors that came into it. The public perception of the red wolf wasn't exactly the best, and there wasn't a lot of public outreach, like I'm doing right now. There wasn't a lot of public outreach. In addition, when they released wolves into Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in 1987, there were no coyotes. Coyotes started infringing upon the area in the late 1990s and started causing issues within the population by hybridizing with red wolves. So in order for landowners and for individuals to feel safe and get rid of a nuisance species, they started shooting coyotes. Well, if you look at a wolf from really, really, really far away, and you look at a coyote from really, really far away, it is really hard to distinguish the difference between the two, even more so as when they started hybridizing. So our gunshot mortality rate started going really, really, really high up, and we started losing individuals really fast. In addition, we started getting more tourism than we did in the late 80s and early 90s. So our vehicle mortality started going up as well. And so this brought into a lot of questions of what to do with the red wolf. So in the early 2010s, we started to reevaluate the red wolf program and the species survival program. That it led to a ruling in 2018, which was another 10J rule that reduced the recovery area from the 5-county area, Dare, Terrell, Hyde, Washington, and Beaufort, to just Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, which you take a large area, truncate it down. And that took place for a while. So with that and being unable to introduce new individuals, only being able to manage on refuge land, and the confusion of coyotes and red wolves and vehicle mortality, we saw a plummet in the red wolf population. So what about now? So we have 8 individuals in the wild. What is happening now that to keep the red wolves from having another brink of extinction from the wild? Well, there was a lot of big changes that happened. One of them being my existence in this program. So multiple nonprofit organizations have put efforts towards red wolf education and outreach. So my position is solely exists for red wolf education and outreach and assisting Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge with programs. So North Carolina Wildlife Federation has really tried taking steps in helping with that public outreach and understanding. Defenders of Wildlife, Wildlands Network, and Red Wolf Coalition all work towards public understanding and awareness of the red wolf. In addition, we are able to do coyote sterilization. So this allows for coyotes to be sterilized on the landscape and then put back into the landscape to both reduce hybridization with red wolves and also become placeholders in coyote territory. And I'll explain placeholders a bit more later on, but that's kind of a new thing to wrap our heads around. Another thing that we have going on is prey for the pack. So I mentioned earlier that habitat fragmentation was a big part of losing red wolves throughout the southeast region of the United States. And Prey for the Pack is a cost share program that is based around working with private landowners to support red wolf habitat, as well as benefit private landowners in their own goals for their land. And this is a program between Fish and Wildlife Service and North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And I believe we have over 1,000 acres signed up for that program to date, which is awesome. In addition, wolves are now fitted with bright orange collars. So previously wolves were fitted with black collars, which weren't very noticeable. And recently they started being fit with orange collars to help prevent and reduce gunshot mortality within the species. So if someone is looking to remove a coyote from their land, if they see an orange collar, they know that is definitely a red wolf, and that helps kind of protect the red wolf. And what's really exciting is the 10J rule of 2018 that reduced the recovery area to just Alligator River was repealed in fall of 2021, so this past fall. So this allows the Red Wolf Recovery Program to resume full force in what they do. So pup fostering, reintroduction, monitoring all across the 5-county area, which is fantastic because it means that they can start working towards species recovery again. And we talk a lot about recovery, and I've spitballed a couple of different phrases out, like the captive breeding program, introductions, pup fostering, coyote sterilization. And now that we get to do it, I really want to go ahead and talk about what it means to do all of these steps, because they are integral to recovering a species. So the first thing that I want to talk about is captive breeding, and it has to be probably one of the most important things to have within a species recovery program, especially one like the red wolf, where every single red wolf is from 14 founding individuals. So currently, from that point in the 1970s, where we had Point Defiance Sioux helped establish the captive breeding program, we now have 45 facilities that are part of our captive breeding program. And there's plans to add more facilities to that as well to create more space to increase our numbers. We also have 241 captive individuals across these facilities, which is fantastic because it means we have more opportunities for breeding pairs. And we actually increased our breeding pair numbers from 30 to 38 to support this 2021-2022 breeding season, with the hopes that we can do more pup fostering this year. So fingers crossed on that. Captive breeding is actually the backbone to red wolf genetics. So when you have such a small population that you're starting out with, you can have what ecologists call a genetic bottleneck. And that's where you have so little genetic diversity, so not a lot of different things, that you start creating other biological issues when you start growing the population. So there's missing genetics and variation across your individuals that you start creating other issues. So I know the elk in Pennsylvania there's theories that they ended up having issues with pregnancy and possibly sperm motility in the male elk or male bull elk. So there's a lot of speculation on whether or not that population had a bottleneck. So it's really important that we have such a strong captive breeding program, because it is very specific as to how to continue to grow the species without creating that genetic bottleneck. And captive individual reintroduction. So it's not really the most effective way to introduce wolves. However, it's very important. The only way to introduce new wolves when there's no breeding pairs in the wild population is to introduce captive wolves. However, they have to be carefully chosen from our captive population, because we want to make sure that they are going to have the best fit and the most likelihood of survivability in the wild. So they do spend quite a bit of time in acclimation pens before being released. However, one of the biggest obstacles that we can say about these captive wolf reintroductions is vehicle mortality. And if you think about it, these wolves have never stepped foot outside of their enclosures, never seen what a vehicle is, never seen what a roadway is. And a lot of times when you're in a new environment and when you're learning new things, you typically need to have an experience with something to learn what it is. And when it's a vehicle and you're a smaller animal, you typically get one chance. So that's been a really big issue for the reintroduction process recently. We actually lost about 4 wolves, if I counted correctly, to vehicle mortalities this last season from individuals that we reintroduced into the wild. So it is actually a really big issue. However, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with help from NCWF are working with NCDOT to deploy electronic message boards to help mitigate that problem. And then next is my favorite and the best and most effective way of introducing new individuals into the wild, and that is pup fostering. They are so cute. So they're the most effective way of adding new individuals and genetics into the wild population. And the reason being is because these are wolves that get to grow up in the wild instead of just be introduced into the wild. So they get a mom that teaches them the ropes, teaches them, hey, this roadway isn't good. Hey, this property isn't okay, or this land isn't okay. Here's our territory, things along those lines. So they're grandfathered into what the wild is and taught by a wild mom. So it has the highest survivability of introducing new individuals. And the downside to it is that it takes an abundance of coordination across the captive facilities, the field staff, and breeding individuals in order to create success with it. So this doesn't exactly happen unless there's a captive born litter that's born at the same exact time or within the same time frame as a wild born litter, and then it can only happen if the wild born and the captive litter both have their eyes closed in order for the transport. So it typically happens very fast. When the field notices that there's a female denning, they start talking to different facilities to see if anything might line up, because it is such a effective way of introducing new individuals that it's a timeline that is relatively fast and important to be on top of. However, if you don't have an established breeding pair in the wild and there's no female denning in the wild, you can't do pup fostering. And that's what's happened. So we actually haven't had pup fostering happen since this last year, since 2014. So from 2014 to 2021, there was no pup fostering that happened within the wild population. And from 2020 until about this last year or so, we haven't actually had a wild litter born on the landscape. And the pups that were fostered in 2021 were fostered into a hybrid den. So it's a very, very specific process, but it's a very important process. So in lieu of the fact that we don't have any breeding pairs, we try to introduce captive individuals to create breeding pairs so that we can do pup fostering. So it's a nice little zigzag of conditions in order to introduce new genetics and new individuals. And the last one is coyote sterilization. So the main thing of coyote sterilization and what it is spay or neutering coyotes. It prevents red wolves from hybridizing with coyotes. So obviously we don't want the red wolf genetics mixed with coyote genetics. But at the same time, it also creates placeholders in coyote territories. And I mentioned this earlier, and I said I was going to go over what placeholders means. And what placeholders are is that they are individuals that can hold a certain amount of area. So they can defend a certain amount of area. And why this is so important and good for the red wolf program is that if you can create placeholders surrounding red wolf populations, but they're sterilized, then you can have the red wolf population grow without the risk of hybridization and without the risk of more coyotes coming in, because that placeholder defends his territory, but he doesn't accept newcomers. So it's a really, really effective strategy. We've seen it on the landscape, and it's honestly remarkable, but it only works if we can keep those placeholders alive and if we can catch the coyotes in order to sterilize them. But it's a really cool way of red wolf recovery to help with the problem of coyote populations, because as we know, they are very prolific breeders and they're very adaptable to different kinds of environments. So in the future, and this is a pretty near future, there is a total of 9 adults planned to be released into the recovery area, an established family group, so a female and a male, that are a breeding pair and their 3 offspring are going to be introduced as a pack, and hopefully they have the higher likelihood of just settling down where they get released, and they'll establish themselves there. And then 2 established breeding pairs will also be released. So we're hoping that with these releases that they'll be able to develop actual breeding pairs in the wild for us to foster pups into in the future. So that is our hope for this upcoming season. So we're hoping to have all of these guys released. I believe the plan, the latest, is March 2022. Things always change, so don't hold me too much to that. But that is the plan, is to have these 9 individuals released into the wild this upcoming year. So next comes the next question is, how can you help? So I find this question happens a lot whenever I talk about red wolves, and of course the very long road that the species has taken in recovery in the last 30 plus years. And the biggest way I can say to help is first talk about red wolves, because I come from Pennsylvania. I didn't even know what a red wolf was until I was in college taking mammalogy, which I find a little shameful, but talking about red wolves, putting red wolves out into the air and talking about the fact that they even exist, donating. So you can actually donate to NCWF or any of the collaborating organizations helping in the recovery effort. We fund multiple different things. NCWF just bought the electronic message boards. I believe we also just purchased some acclimation pen material as well. It's all of it counts towards helping recover the species. You can also call your representatives. You can voice your support for the Endangered Species Act, and also voice your support for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or even just write in your support of red wolves in North Carolina landscape. You can also share information about red wolves. So, talking about red wolves, joining the newsletters for red wolves, following the Red Wolf Recovery page on Facebook, and following any of the nonprofit organizations that are involved to keep up to date on what is happening within the red wolf world. You can also join your wildlife advocacy groups connected with the program. So Triad Wild or Concord Wildlife Chapter. You can become a volunteer. So I'm working towards creating more of a volunteer atmosphere surrounding the red wolves. We're hoping to be able to create more improvements to the education atmosphere, as well as a way for people to just get to see the red wolves in general. And if you live in Columbia, we are hoping to create a Columbia chapter of North Carolina Wildlife Federation, hopefully. But if you live in Columbia, contact me. I'd love to meet you, and I'd love to see if we can start a chapter out there, because conservation is really important, and having a wildlife group there where it's right in the middle of red wolf territory would be fantastic. But with that, I will gladly take any questions, and there is my email if you would like to email me for anything. But yeah.
Thank you, Katerina, for that presentation. That was awesome. I have a question for you. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's involved with the pup fostering, exactly what that process is?
Yes. So pup fostering, so if we find that there is a litter born in captivity and a litter born in the wild, and they so happen to line up in their time frames, what happens is there's this last go around, we actually ended up flying in the pups from Akron, Ohio. And what'll happen is we'll bring them over to the wild den when the female is out, and we will ordinarily put urine on the pups and kind of really get their smells mingled up together in order for the female to be more likely to accept them. And in a way for us to figure out if she's accepted them or not is typically if a red wolf female, a denning female, finds that her den has been disturbed, she'll move them. So if she moves all of the pups, then we know that it's a successful pup foster. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. It does. And we've got quite a few comments in the chat. Let me see. Serena says she was excited to see the signs in action on her trip to the Outer Banks recently. So we might want to talk a little bit more about those signs, but let's see what the questions are. Peter says, it's this understanding that coyote populations are on the comeback. Why do you think they're having success while the red wolves are not?
That is a great question. So the reason why coyotes have such a success and why you see it widespread across the United States as there's less predators over in the eastern part is that coyotes have this adaptability to be able to live in areas where there's high human populations. So whether you live in Raleigh, you live in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, or you live in Columbia, North Carolina, there's always an opportunity for coyotes to thrive. They tend to do fine with these areas that have high human traffic. They're really, really great breeders. And if you take one out of the wild, so you say you shoot a coyote and it dies and there's another coyote next to it, coyotes can recognize that absence of other individuals within the environment and increase their breeding throughout the year and increase their litter size. So they tend to be really successful in these areas because they have those kinds of adaptability built within them. So they've been quite a conservation topic because of how prolific they are and how effective they are at surviving. Whereas when you have wolves, they're so particular to how much space they need to take up and what they do and their breeding season that they don't have that same adaptability as coyotes do. But they hold a different value within the environment than coyotes do. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Suzanne says, I believe Georgia Pacific owns large tracts of land in Georgia, assuming this area is appropriate for red wolves. Is there any plan to approach them to allow red wolves in that area?
So there's actually currently I'm trying to find the right term. I believe it's considered the recovery team. There's a team of about 50 individuals that are brought together currently that are working on a recovery plan for the species. And that is set to be released in February 2023. So that may include also the possibility of extra non-essential population recovery areas as well. So at this point, I'm not entirely sure if Georgia is on their mind. However, we'll know in February 2023 about the possibility of other populations coming in.
Okay, sounds good. And that recovery team, is that across different nonprofits, Fish and Wildlife? Is it a conglomeration of different?
It's a conglomeration. So it's a whole mesh of people and red wolf experts.
Good. All right, a question from, I think, Tara. How do they capture the coyotes for sterilization? And also, is the North Carolina Wildlife Federation doing any local community outreach about protecting red wolves?
So the way that they catch coyotes and the way that they also catch red wolves is they use foothold traps. And I just realized I didn't include a picture of that. And basically what these foothold traps is they will go and bait an area for wolves or coyotes. And there are these little traps that are kind of like a mouth. And if the coyote or the wolf steps into it, it closes around the foot. It doesn't break the foot. It doesn't hurt. I've set it off with my own hand. And it just holds them into place until one of our biologists can come out and evaluate the individual and see if they are eligible for the Coyote Sterilization program, or if they're a red wolf, they'll take a blood sample to do genetic testing, things along those lines. And community outreach for red wolves. Currently, I host red wolf programs that are just basic red wolf programs at the Red Wolf Center in Columbia, North Carolina on Wednesdays. And I'm hoping to branch out more to connect with our kid population. So to go to schools and talk about red wolves and really be able to get out there and put red wolves back on the map. I managed to go to Terrell County Elementary School, and it was a fantastic time. Those kids were adorable.
All right. So do they tag the coyotes that are sterilized so that they know?
Yes.
Go through testing to find out, do they wear a collar or how do they know?
Yes. So what ends up happening if a coyote is eligible for sterilization, they'll get sterilized. Ordinarily, they have a recovery time and they'll get fitted with a black radio collar. So when they're released back out, we are able to monitor them and where they are on the landscape.
Elaine asked, are red wolf pack dynamics the same as gray wolves?
So it depends on what you think of gray wolf pack dynamics. So there's been a lot of change about the behavior of wolves in the last couple of years. But what I will say is red wolves are basically just a family unit. Whereas if you look at the Yellowstone packs, it may be made up of some wolves that aren't part of the family unit. So red wolves are typically just the mom and the dad and the yearlings, and maybe even an older pup that decided to stick around. It typically is just within the family, and then they branch out when they've decided to outgrow or decide to establish another breeding pair. But yeah.
And why was North Carolina selected to be the recovery area?
So I believe it was my own idea behind it, and I've heard it, but I don't believe it's sound information. Even on the recovery area website, it doesn't really exactly state why Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge was chosen. However, I would believe it's because there's like 9 refuges within this area. So you have Alligator River, you have Pea Island, you have Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, you have Lake Mattamuskeet, you have Cedar Island, you have Swan Quarter, Great Dismal Swamp in the north, Mackey Island. So you have all these areas that are already protected. They're wildlife refuges. And it's still part of red wolf habitat. So I would assume it's probably because there's a large amount of land that is protected for wildlife. However, that would be my own personal assumption.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Okay, so similar question, and it's going to kind of lead into the Texas, Louisiana population. Did you recently see the New York Times article about the Galveston Island canids?
Yes.
And that study. And so I guess also that ties into why did Fish and Wildlife choose Eastern North Carolina instead of reestablishing in Texas and Louisiana?
So I can't speak on to why they chose North Carolina over Texas and Louisiana. However, that finding of Galveston, Texas and Louisiana, of that remnant of red wolf down there, really speaks volumes about the persistence of the species. So again, we have our recovery team that's speaking about the different survivability of the red wolves in different areas that may be suitable to reintroduce red wolves. And I'm hoping possibly Texas and Louisiana are considered part of that as well, just because of that persistence.
Yeah, different habitat too. So interesting. Yes, this presentation will be distributed to the group via email, and then it will also be posted probably on our website as well as NCWF's website. Is it possible that the red wolves have migrated to the Umori National Forest in central North Carolina? Well, that's an interesting question.
So currently we don't know of any known red wolves in central part of North Carolina. The ones that we know for sure, because we can track, are in Alligator River and Pocosin Lakes area. However, if you have sightings and are wondering, you can absolutely go ahead and send pictures to me or Joe Madison, part of the Red Wolf Recovery Program. And we're always interested to see pictures and see if there's even a possibility. I mean,
wow, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
And we're sure the orange colors include GPS tracking so that you know where the wolves are.
So GPS tracking is one of those things that is both really, really, really good, but also really, really hard to do. And that's because when you release a wolf on the landscape, there's no guarantee that you're going to catch it again. So for example, we've decided to switch all the wolves over to orange collars. However, there is one individual on the landscape that we cannot catch, and she still has a black collar. So with that being said, radio collars have a longer lifespan than GPS collars, especially if your GPS collar, you want it to give you a point every day or a point twice a day. It can really deplete the battery life on a collar. And once that battery life is gone on the collar, you lose all ability to track that individual. So there's a trade-off. However, we did fit 2 wolves this past year with radio collars. However, they both suffered a mortality, so we no longer have a GPS individual on the landscape. And I don't know where the program is standing with putting GPS collars on this next release plan.
Oh, right. Would you automatically collar the 9 introductions that you're getting ready to do? You would assume
Yes.
so, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll all get a collar of some sort, whether it's a radio collar that has that longer lifespan or a GPS collar that has that shorter lifespan.
Okay. Do we know in historical context when the red wolf territory met the gray wolf territory, did they interbreed?
So I don't have an exact answer for you on that one, but I do know that's a big question up in Pennsylvania because of the gray wolf and the red wolf overlapping, and then the idea of coy wolves in Pennsylvania, where you have this hybridization of some sort of wolf and coyote. But because they're 2 distinct species, I'm really not sure. I'm going to be honest. I'm really not sure. I can probably theorize with taxonomy and probably put all of you guys to sleep with that theory, but I don't have any assurance in my answer.
Okay, fair enough. Jim, I'm not sure what you're exactly asking here, but Jim Eldred asked, regarding dynamics, please talk about prey. Does that
So, the prey that the red wolves typically take is 50% of their diet is made up of white-tailed deer, and then a good portion of their diet is actually raccoon, and then of course nutria and smaller game animals. However, they're mostly going after deer, weaker and sicker deer, but they're mostly going after deer for their main prey source.
So that is actually helpful to most landowners, right? To
Mhm.
remove some deer off of their land?
It depends. You know, it's always providing the information of what we know about red wolf populations and what we know about red wolf behavior. So for sometimes presenting about white-tailed deer and saying that wolves could possibly predate on them tends to cause concern for those landowners that their livelihood is based around renting their property for hunting for large game. So it's always making sure that, you know, you present the information available and of course have them make their best educated decision.
Right. Well, I know that I guess with the Western population, Ted Turner has a ranch with, I believe, what, elk and bison, and I'm not sure what all on, but he has a wildlife biologist who studies just the wolf population on his land, and that they have consistently found that those wolves take out the sick and the weak and don't prey upon the stronger animals that they want to see thrive on their property. So they've actually found it to be incredibly beneficial. It's just
I can speak for Yellowstone because I actually got to witness Doug Smith speak about the Yellowstone wolves, but gray wolves are pretty bad hunters, and are pretty big wimps. If a prey will turn around on them, so maybe like an elk turn around on them, they tend to scatter and lose their pursuit. So it's one of those things that I fully believe that they would absolutely take down the weaker and the sicker individuals in the herd.
right, kind of the vulture in a way, taking care of things that
Yeah.
that need to be taken care of. Let's see, belts. Would you be willing to Zoom with classrooms about this topic? Marlene asks.
Yes, I would. And I've I Zoomed with a classroom in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and that was a really good time. I would love to Zoom with classrooms. That would be fantastic.
That's a great idea. And what is Rule 10 exactly?
The 10J rule.
10J,
Yes.
sorry.
So the 10J rule is just it's kind of just what they call what is allowed for the Red Wolf Recovery Program. So it's the ruling that says you can do X, Y, and Z within this area or for this species. So and of course it changed. There's a 1995 rule, which is the one that says that we can do Red Wolf recovery work across the 5-county area. And then there was the 2018 version of the 10J rule, which said that we can only do Red Wolf work within Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. So it's just the label that they have for that. I hope that makes sense.
And is that a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service rule?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So do other species on the endangered species list, do they have their own rule that's not a 10J, but it's something different, or are all rules called a 10J rule for the species?
I can't speak on that. I've only ever worked for the Red Wolf Recovery Program, so I'm not sure of how the endangered species world outside of red wolves works in terms of Fish and Wildlife Service, official documentation, and things like that.
Okay. What locations do captive breeding in North Carolina?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to think.
The North Carolina Zoo is on that program?
Yes, museum. Oh my gosh, I'm going to say the wrong one because there's two right in the same area.
Right.
Museum of Life and Sciences, I believe. It's the one in Durham. Actually has a breeding pair there, and I believe they had a set of litters there this last year, if I remember correctly.
Isn't the Greensboro Science Center also?
Sorry, I'm trying to map out all the locations in my head.
No, that's all right.
Or maybe approximately how many there are even in North
There's
Carolina.
in North Carolina, from my last map, I'm picturing in my head, I think there's about 4. I'm going to say give or take 4. There are a couple of institutions that house red wolves and do the Red Wolf Recovery Program. However, I can follow up with that information once I look on our species recovery page. I'll be able to see it by state.
And then it seems like there's one just over the border into Virginia, on the northeast side of things. I can't remember the name of that, but it seems like there's one fairly close.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure on that one.
Can't remember the name of it either. Okay, so then do the red wolves choose one mate for life, or will they switch around during different breeding seasons?
So they typically stay with the same mate for the rest of their days. So we have a pair, or had a pair, because that male is no longer here. That was a bonded pair on Alligator River, and they produced several litters throughout their time together, and that female hasn't taken to another male since he passed away.
Oh.
Yeah.
Jim wonders, is shooting mortality among sterilized coyotes a problem? I think we'd like to protect those if possible, but you said they're fitted with a black collar. Does that help?
So gunshot mortality within coyotes is it's a struggle in the sense that, of course, we want to keep these individuals because they can provide such a large benefit to our Red Wolf program. But it's also a state species as well. So there's a fine line of that management and what exactly happens within those individuals. However, in terms of the mortality of gunshots, other than red wolf gunshot mortality, I don't hear much about the coyote gunshot mortality for our collared individuals.
Guess you don't have a way of knowing when that happens, do you? Would you have a way? Ordinarily,
Yeah, ordinarily I hear it from our Red Wolf team. However, I don't hear about it as often, mostly because we're closely following that Red Wolf population.
Okay. I know we have a couple more questions, and this is awesome. So glad everybody's asking so many questions. I do want you to get a minute just to talk about those electronic message boards and what they're going to do for the safety of passage for these red wolves that are being introduced down there. If you could talk about that, and then I'm going to go through these. There's a few more questions as well.
Sure. So NCWF helped in purchasing 2 electronic message boards for Fish and Wildlife Service. Fish and Wildlife Service purchased an additional 2. And what these electronic message boards are going to be used for is when we release new individuals or we see that wolves may be hanging around roadways. So what we're hoping is if we put these boards out on the roadway, so more specifically, if we put them out on 64, it'll hopefully entice drivers to maybe be a bit more aware of their surroundings and a bit more of what's going on the sides of the road than they would be typically driving through that area. As many people know, Highway 64 leading into the Outer Banks cuts right through Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And it is a big place for individuals to be speeding, and it's also a large place where wildlife vehicle mortality occurs. So we are hoping that with our releases upcoming that we can put electronic message boards out before we do our releases in order to help with public perception of maybe slowing down a bit or being more mindful of the roadways. So we're hoping to deploy one of those on 64 in the near future. But we're hoping that it'll reduce the vehicle mortality. It's no guarantee, but it's a way to try to take a step forward.
Okay. Anne mentions that I'm terrible with pronouncing this. Is it Weyerhaeuser offered to support the monitoring of wolves on lands adjacent to the wildlife refuges in eastern North Carolina, which would be an important conservation partnership between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and a private corporation, which is nice to see.
Sorry, say that one more time.
That Weyerhaeuser, not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, offered to support the monitoring of wolves on lands adjacent to the wildlife refuges in eastern North Carolina, which is an important conservation partnership between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and a private corporation. So just making a statement that that's a positive.
Awesome. Yeah, thing, I wasn't sure if that was something. Yeah.
And if you want to speak to that anymore, you're welcome to chime in. How does the red wolf population affect the population of coyotes? Does it affect it at all? I would guess they're so small, they can't really have an impact on the coyotes.
It actually does.
It does.
So we find that red wolves can actually outcompete coyotes on the landscape, which is part of the importance of public outreach, because many people don't think that's possible. However, red wolves are found to actually push coyotes out of territories. So that's why having those placeholders are so important, because you reduce the amount of coyotes in the area. So you reduce the idea of a coyote hybridizing with a red wolf, but you also provide that opportunity for, as the red wolf population grows, the more likelihood you can push out coyotes and have less of those middle predators out on your landscape. So it was something that we were starting to see with one of the wolves that passed away this year. He was slowly pushing out a coyote from a territory, and then he faced a mortality, but it's really, really cool. So they actually do outcompete coyotes on the landscape, which is why they're such a positive to have on the landscape.
Wow, I'm surprised at that. That's very interesting. And how big is the recovery area now?
So it encompasses the 5-county area. And within that 5-county area, there's a good 110,000 plus acre refuge. So I'm going to assume over 100,000 acres, if not around 200,000 acres. I don't have the exact number, but it's a pretty large area that we consider the recovery area.
So that seems to be maybe the safest place for them in the state, to have that much acreage with not as much population in that area. So
Yeah, so and of course it's really important to have good relations with our private landowners because they are the bridge of allowing these wolves to survive on the landscape, because you have one refuge in Dare County, and then you have another one that's across Alligator River and in like 3 different counties, and that's kind of a big break in that population and that ability to move across the area when there's private land in between them. So having that good relation with public landowners and that understanding of red wolves on the landscape is really useful.
And do I recall that you said 1,000 landowners have signed up for the Pray for the Pack?
1,000 acres are
1,000
signed on.
acres are signed up.
Acres, yes,
Acres.
sorry.
How many landowners would that be then?
I believe it is 3 official landowners.
Okay. And that's a 10-year agreement that they
Yes.
sign on for, correct? So that would be a good thing to expand, to get more
Yes.
landowners involved in that.
So
Okay.
we are working on it. So I always butcher his name and I always apologize every time, but Luke Lawless, I messed up his first name. Luke Lawless is the habitat biologist or habitat manager for the Fish and Wildlife Service for Pray for the Pack. So he's done an amazing job in reaching out to local landowners and fostering that conversation about red wolves and Pray for the Pack. So we're hoping to add more landowners onto the Pray for the Pack program in this coming year.
Good. Barbara comments that there's a facility in Asheville, maybe called Brother Wolf. Is that possibly one of the breeding facilities? Does that ring a bell?
I've never heard of that one. But when we have our partnership calls, so when we all meet with all of the facilities that do captive breeding or organizations that work with red wolves, there is a large number of people on those calls, and you don't always get to hear everyone speak. So it could be, but that name doesn't ring a bell to me.
Okay. Do the red wolves hunt as individuals or in packs?
They're definitely more effective when they are in their pack dynamic. So taking down larger prey like white-tailed deer typically takes a couple wolves in order to do, because they're such a large animal. However, if they're on their own, small game is their best bet. But they typically do hunt together.
Okay. Talking about wilds, Dan Nichols is a great place to see captive red wolves. We visited and seen them in very close proximity, according to Suzanne. Not sure where that is, Dan Nichols. And Wild Sides produced a film several years ago about red wolves in North Carolina, Staring Down Fate. I'm sorry, is the name of it.
Oh, with Chris
Might be on Amazon.
Lukash. Yes.
Right?
Yes, with Chris Lukash. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
It's a
for
great
that.
film.
I haven't heard of that. That does sound really great. Staring Down Fate. Okay. I think that we'll see. What about some sort of wildlife corridor, passover, or under the road, which is safe passage, which is a hot topic right now in the conservation world. We have an upcoming talk on that. I believe that's our March. It's March or April. I'm not sure. It's on our calendar coming up that we will have a talk by the North Carolina Parks. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm messing that up, but it's on our website as to who's going to be offering that talk. And I do think that that's certainly a great movement that's happening right now. I don't know if there's any talk about that on the Eastern Coast for the wolves.
So it's funny you mentioned that. Back in 2007, they were planning a highway widening project for 64 through this area of Alligator River, and built into that project, before that highway widening project, was actually wildlife corridors. However, it never got funding to be completed. So now it's something that some of the other nonprofit organizations and I believe NCWF is starting to bring to the table again because of the recent infrastructure bill. And of course, all the red wolf mortalities. I believe Wildlands Network is taking an assessment of the highest wildlife mortalities due to vehicle passage. in North Carolina. Tara, you should correct me if I am wrong, please, because you're also involved in those.
No, that's totally fine. There are also 3 underpasses on I-64 too that were established back in the day. I don't remember the exact year, but those are also out there in existence currently and could use some upkeep to get them back up and going. But there were signs of red wolves and a few other species out there who were using them also. So yeah, awesome.
I love those wildlife cams, the camera traps that they put on the corridors, and you get to watch the wildlife using them. I think that's just fascinating. So I hope to see a lot more of that in not just in North Carolina, but everywhere. You know, our roads cause a lot of trouble for our wildlife. A few more questions and then we'll call it an evening. Joni wants to know how many individuals are in captive breeding. She says you may have said that already. Do you recall it on a slide?
So as of August 2021, the captive breeding program, I believe, was 241 on my slide.
Okay.
Now I'm a little scared. 241. Yeah.
That's awesome. It's very, very hopeful, right?
Yes.
And Suzanne says Dan Nichols is located in Salisbury, North Carolina. So that's where you can go and see red wolves in captivity. I haven't heard of that before, so that's good to know. A couple of thank yous to you and words of encouragement about hearing young people are interested in this and just getting them connected to nature. And, you know, education is a huge piece of this. So
yes,
we need to all do our part to encourage young people to connect to nature and teach them as much as we can. It is a truly important task in our role as adults, I think, to do that. Let's see. Heather reminds everyone that Safe Passage, our Safe Passage talk, is coming up on March the 8th. So if you visit our website, triadwild.org, you'll see that on there. And it's with Jeff Hunter from National Parks Conservation Association. Thank you, Heather. I think that's about it. Kat, thank you so very much for all of that. And thank you everyone for your great questions. That was an incredible array of topics that we got to cover. If anyone wants to speak up and say anything with Kat, feel free to unmute yourself and say something. And if not, this was fantastic. And I just had a great time tonight. Super nervous about doing it with it being our first one.
See you next week.
I think it went great.
See you next Thursday, actually.
Okay. Sounds good. We will see everybody next time. Stay in touch via
See you next Thursday.
social media and on our website as we determine where we're meeting, what the next thing is, whether it will be via Zoom or whether we'll try to do a hybrid. Our next event will be in February, where we're talking about creating a bird and wildlife habitat in your yard. And Carol Bowie Jackson of Matthews will be leading that meeting for us. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Kat.
Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everybody. Good
Thanks,
night.
Kat.
Yes, thank you, Kat. Great job. Thanks.